Ava Johnson never imagined that her peaceful and pleasant life would shatter in an instant. At 35, she lived in a prestigious neighborhood on the outskirts of Dallas, Texas, in a large house with a lush garden and a white fence, a place she always considered full of love and security. But one night, a horrifying truth would change everything forever. She stood in the darkness of the kitchen, her hands trembling, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The phone screen in her hands revealed a truth her mind couldn't even begin to accept. Betrayal? With someone she never could have imagined, not even in her worst nightmares? Her husband, Nicholas Johnson, a successful lawyer at a major firm, was always a busy man. He often stayed late at the office, but every night he would return home with a smile to be with his family. Their son, Elliot, was 8 years old, and their daughter, Lily, was only 5. The children were Ava's world. She worked as an elementary school teacher and seized every opportunity to be with them. Ava and Nicholas had met in college. She was studying education and passionate about teaching, while Nicholas, with his boundless ambition and self-confidence, was pursuing a bright future in law. Their relationship quickly progressed, and a year later, they married. Their life went just as planned: successful marriage, stable homes, beloved children, and a home in one of the best neighborhoods. Ava always took pride in this life. They had faced many challenges, but they had always stayed together. Difficult moments, their children's illnesses, financial troubles, everything had been solved with each other's help. For Ava, Nicholas was not only her husband, but also her best friend and companion. Their home was filled with laughter and joy. They would have family game nights, watch movies, and on weekends, go for picnics in the park or short trips to Lake Lewis. These moments felt so natural and permanent that Ava never imagined anything could tear them apart. But slowly she began to notice changes in Nicholas. He started coming home later than usual. He no longer suggested taking walks or dining out. His mood had changed. Sometimes he would fall deep into thought and seem to be worried about something. Ava attributed this behavior to his workload. Nicholas was responsible for important cases, and she understood that. So she tried to keep their home a calm and pleasant place for him. However, Ava's worries grew more intense. Nicholas became more silent, and sometimes on weekends, he would leave the house under the pretext of work trips. More importantly, his behavior with his phone had changed. He used to leave it anywhere he sat, but now he always kept it in his pocket or face down. Ava felt that something was happening, but she was terrified of asking directly. A part of her warned that she needed to uncover the truth, but another part was afraid of what she might hear. She tried many times to talk to Nicholas, asking about his work and how he was feeling, but each time she was met with a fake smile and repetitive phrases. "Everything's fine, I'm just a bit tired." In those moments, Ava found herself seeking refuge more than ever with her mother, Julia. A few years ago, Julia had moved to Dallas to be closer to her daughter and grandchildren. She was not just Ava's mother, but also her best friend and confidant. They would talk for hours about life, family problems, and personal matters. Julia was always a reliable support for Ava, someone she could trust and seek advice from. Ava hoped these problems were temporary and that her family would soon return to the peace they once had. She didn't want to believe the worst and still held on to hope for the best. After all, they had a good life, amazing children, and years of shared happiness. How could everything possibly fall apart? These thoughts tormented Ava. While she tried to maintain the appearance of her normal life, continuing with her daily tasks, taking care of the kids, and keeping the house tidy, she struggled to keep the dark thoughts at bay, convincing herself that things would get better. But deep down, she knew that big changes were coming. Ava had no idea that her usual morning in their cozy home would turn into a living nightmare. It all started when she accidentally noticed Nicholas's phone left on the kitchen table. He had gone to work early that morning, and the house had settled into a quiet calm. The kids weren't home. They had stayed with their grandmother for the weekend, and Ava planned to have some time for herself. She was brewing coffee and gazing out at their lush yard when the phone screen lit up with a message. Ava wasn't the type of person to snoop on her husband, but something in that moment drew her attention to the phone screen. She walked closer and saw that the message was from her mother, Julia. Only the beginning of the sentence was visible. I can't wait to see you again. These words took Ava by surprise. She had no reason to doubt her mother or her husband, but the message seemed strange. Why would her mother send such a thing to Nicholas? Curiosity mixed with anxiety took hold of her. She picked up the phone and, without hesitation, unlocked it. She and Nicholas had never hidden their phone passwords from each other, so access was easy. When she opened the conversation, Ava was frozen in place. Julie and Nicholas had been exchanging messages for months. These weren't just friendly or family chats. Every line of the messages was filled with hidden hints, intimate moments, and words Ava never imagined would pass between her mother and her husband. The messages were full of references to secret meetings, hidden embraces, and meaningful words. They talked about how they had kept their relationship hidden from everyone. In one of the more recent messages, her mother had written, "You're so careful, no one will ever find out. This will remain between us." Ava felt her heart tighten with pain. She sat down in the kitchen, feeling as if the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she couldn't let herself break down. Not yet. She needed to gather all the facts to understand the full extent of the betrayal. She continued reading the messages, uncovering more details. Each message was like a blow to her heart. It was as if every new sentence was tearing her apart. Her mother and Nicholas had been seeing each other behind her back for various excuses. They hadn't just lied to Ava, but also to her children. The messages mentioned pretending at family gatherings, how they acted as if everything was normal. Ava couldn't believe that such a thing was happening in her life. Several hours had passed since she found the phone. Throughout this time, she had been immersed in shock and sorrow, trying to figure out what her next step should be. Her mother, the person she had always trusted, had betrayed her. Her husband, the man she had built a life with and raised children with, had turned out to be a liar. She knew she couldn't just let it go, but what should she do? In that moment, Ava wasn't ready to confront them. She felt betrayed, but she still didn't know how to react. She decided to stay calm and avoid making rash decisions. First and foremost, she needed to gather more information. She knew this phone was now the key to the truth. Her mind was racing with thoughts, and a plan began to form in her heart. In the days that followed, Ava tried to act as though everything was normal. She smiled at Nicholas, talked to him about future plans, and pretended that their life was as it always had been. But in her mind, she had no peace, not even for a moment. Every night when Nicholas was asleep, she would check his phone and gather more evidence of their affair. Throughout all this, her heart was being torn apart with pain and anger. She also began avoiding meetings with her mother, fearing that she wouldn't be able to control herself and would reveal everything. At the same time, she felt that Julia had become suspicious and realized that her daughter had discovered something. This increased the tension between them, and Ava started planning how to confront them with the truth. On July 14, 2023, the Harris family home was immersed in a heavy silence. Ava had neither peaceful nights nor days. Every time she looked at Nicholas, a wave of pain and betrayal consumed her. She could no longer hide her emotions, but for the sake of the children, she tried to maintain appearances. Nicholas, who had noticed Ava's changed behavior, began acting suspiciously. He realized that Ava had grown cold and distant, but he hesitated to ask why. Perhaps he hoped everything would resolve on its own, or maybe he didn't want to escalate the issue. But deep down, he knew that the damage was done and the truth couldn't stay hidden for much longer. That evening, everything seemed normal. The kids were in the living room having dinner, Ava was in the kitchen preparing food, and Nicholas sat at the table reading the news on his tablet. But beneath this normal exterior, suppressed emotions were building up, ready to explode. The air was thick with the sense of an impending disaster. When the kids went to bed, the suffocating silence set in. Ava glanced at Nicholas again, feeling that she could no longer keep pretending. All day, her thoughts tormented her about how they had reached this point. Her husband and her mother, the two closest people in her life, had turned into traitors. This thought burned her from within. She couldn't remain silent any longer. She walked toward Nicholas, trying to stay calm, though she was boiling inside. "We need to talk." Her voice was tense but firm. Nicholas looked up from his tablet, a cautious expression on his face. He sensed something was wrong but couldn't quite figure out what. He pretended not to understand, hoping to avoid the conversation. "What exactly do you want to talk about?" He tried to mask his anxiety. Ava froze in place, her eyes filled with pain and anger. She wanted to scream everything out, accuse Nicholas, but she controlled herself. She knew that shouting wouldn't help. "I know everything, Nicholas." Her voice was calm but resolute. "I know that you and my mother are together." These words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Nicholas immediately lost color. His hands trembled and his tablet slipped from his grasp, landing softly on the table. He didn't know what to say. Panic flared up inside him. He hadn't expected Ava to discover the truth so soon. "Ava, it's not what you think," he began to explain, trying to come up with an excuse, but he knew it was useless. Ava raised her hand to stop him. "Don't. I've seen your messages. All of them. You lied to me. You betrayed our family, and now I want to know how you could do this." Her voice quivered, but she tried to stay strong. Nicholas lowered his head, unable to find the words. His thoughts were racing, from guilt to fear of what might come next. He knew Ava was angry, and he could only guess what her next move would be. But instead of continuing the confrontation, Ava simply turned and walked toward the door. Her body was trembling with tension, knowing that if she stayed there for another minute, she might lose control. She stepped out of the house, took a deep breath of the cool night air, and tried to calm her chaotic mind. She stood in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the night, trying to organize her thoughts. But inside the house, a turning point was unfolding. Nicholas, gripped by fear, decided that he had nothing left to lose. His mind, consumed by terror and despair, imagined the worst possible scenarios. He thought that Ava might go further, maybe reveal everything, destroy his life, and ruin his career. He stood up from his chair, his gaze dark and filled with turmoil. Suddenly, anger mixed with desperation within him. Potential future images marched through his mind. Humiliation, the destruction of his reputation, losing everything he had built. This fear turned into rage. He could no longer afford to lose control. Ava didn't realize that the door behind her had quietly opened, and Nicholas, like a shadow, appeared beside her. He approached from behind, and before she could say or do anything, Nicholas suddenly grabbed her throat. Her scream was muffled by his hands as he tightened his grip. Ava struggled with all her might, her hands futilely trying to pull Nicholas's hands away from her neck. But he was stronger. Her body twisted in a futile attempt to breathe, but with each passing second, her strength faded. Her eyes widened in terror as she realized that her husband, the man she loved, was trying to kill her. The night was dark and silent, and no one heard their struggles. Only the moon, a silent witness, watched this horrifying scene from the shadows of the house. When it was all over, Nicholas stood above Ava's lifeless body, panting heavily, his hands trembling. He looked at her lifeless face, and his mind finally grasped what he had done. This wasn't a dream, nor a nightmare. This was reality. Inside, everything was crushed with fear and guilt. There was no turning back. On the morning of July 15, 2023, with the first rays of sunlight breaking through the trees, police cars arrived in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Austin. One of the neighbors had noticed that something was wrong at the Harris house and called the police. Detective Jessica Miller, an experienced investigator with years of service, was the first to arrive at the crime scene. As the police approached the house, they saw Nicholas Harris standing on the porch. His appearance was disheveled. His eyes were red, as if he hadn't slept the entire night. He stood on the porch, his hands trembling, but he tried to control himself. "What happened?" Detective Miller asked, carefully observing Nicholas. She noticed his anxiety, but didn't want to jump to conclusions just yet. Nicholas, with a soft and trembling voice, said, "My wife. I found her in the backyard. She's dead." His words came out cold and emotionless. Nicholas lowered his head as though trying to hide his emotions. Detective Miller immediately sensed that something wasn't right, but she decided to proceed with caution and precision. She was used to gathering evidence step by step. The police immediately cordoned off the area, and the crime scene team began their investigation. Ava Harris's body lay on the grass in the backyard. Clear signs of strangulation were visible around her neck, indicating that she had been choked. Detective Miller carefully examined the body and the crime scene. There were no signs of a struggle nearby, which made her question, had Ava truly been strangled here? Why was there no sign of a fight? Her clothes appeared untouched, as if she had only stepped outside for a moment but never returned. The questioning of Nicholas began. He sat in the kitchen, staring blankly as if he still couldn't process anything. His responses were short and cold, and Detective Miller noticed that he was avoiding eye contact. "You say you found her this morning?" Miller asked. Nicholas didn't lift his gaze and replied, "Yes, I just went out to the backyard and saw her there. I don't know what happened." "And where were you last night?" Miller continued, trying to keep her tone firm but calm. Nicholas paused, then answered, "After the kids went to bed, I stayed in the house. I went to my room and slept. I woke up early in the morning and went outside." The detectives carefully documented his statement, but Miller knew that this was just the beginning. She had seen how people act when they are hiding something. Perhaps he was simply in shock from his wife's death, but something about his behavior was making her uneasy. The next step was to interview the neighbors. They were shocked by what had happened and shared their observations. Some mentioned hearing muffled noises late at night, but they hadn't thought much of it. No one had seen anything suspicious, which made the investigation more complicated. However, soon the investigation took an interesting turn. Miller discovered that Ava had recently told one of her friends that she had learned about family problems and had uncovered something horrifying. Her friend Mary met with the detectives, and what she revealed became a bombshell for the investigation. "Ava had told me she found out about Nicholas's relationship with her mother," Mary said when she met with the detectives at her home. "She was devastated. She didn't know what to do. We talked just a few days ago. She said she felt betrayed and didn't know how to move forward." This revelation changed everything. Miller realized that they were now dealing with a much more complex situation than initially thought: a family drama, betrayal, and murder. And all of this painted a disturbing picture. The detectives began to investigate Ava's phone, her messages, and her emails. This became the next step in the investigation. They found conversations between Ava and her mother that confirmed the relationship with Nicholas. The messages were filled with guilt and fear of being exposed. Ava's mother had asked her not to destroy everything they had built. Now the detectives had enough evidence to arrest Nicholas Harris. His motives were clearer: the fear of exposure, the fear of losing everything he had. Detective Miller knew that situations like this often lead to violence when someone in desperation tries to maintain control of their life. Soon more evidence came in. Marks found on Nicholas's clothing matched the marks found on Ava's body. He couldn't explain this, and his alibi started to fall apart. Meanwhile, Julia Harris, Ava's mother, was called in for questioning. She appeared to be deeply shocked by her daughter's death, but Detective Miller immediately sensed that there was more hidden beneath the veil of grief. Julia tried to present herself as a grieving mother who had lost her child, but her nervous movements and unusual explanations revealed an underlying tension. Slowly, the pressure of the interrogation became unbearable, and Julia gave in. She confessed to her relationship with Nicholas and claimed that she had tried to end the affair. According to her, she had no knowledge of Nicholas's intentions and was horrified by what had happened. When Detective Jessica Miller brought Nicholas Harris into the interrogation room, her heart tightened with the tension. She knew that the moment of truth had arrived. All the evidence they had gathered over the past few days pointed to Nicholas as the prime suspect in the murder of Ava Harris. But Miller knew well that investigations often have unexpected twists, and she had to be ready for anything. Nicholas appeared exhausted. His once neat and composed appearance was disheveled, and his eyes, once full of confidence, were now filled with fear and confusion. As he sat across from Detective Miller, she could see how hard he was trying to control himself. But every movement revealed the inner turmoil he was experiencing. "Nicholas," Miller began calmly, "we know there have been problems in your family. We are aware of your relationship with Ava's mother, and now we have evidence that shows you were near her the night she died." Nicholas clenched his fists, and his face twisted with pain and anger. "I didn't want it to end like this," he whispered, diverting his gaze from the detective. Miller noticed that his fingers were tapping relentlessly on the table. Her goal was simple. She needed to get Nicholas to confess. He realized that the psychological pressure could break him, but he didn't want to rush. A slow and methodical approach was his strategy, and he intended to follow it through to the end. "Nicholas," she continued, leaning slightly forward, We know you felt trapped. Ava discovered the truth, and you feared what might happen next. These words seemed to hit a sensitive point in Nicholas. He quickly lifted his head and looked at Miller. His eyes flickered between anger and fear, and Miller knew his emotional defenses were starting to crumble. "You don't understand," he began, his voice trembling. "Everything had gotten so complicated. I loved Ava, but then everything spiraled out of control. I didn't know how to handle the situation." Miller nodded, signaling that she was listening and not judging him. This was a crucial moment in the interrogation, giving him the feeling that Miller was on his side and ready to hear his story. "Tell me what happened that night," she softly requested. Nicholas remained silent for a few moments, as if weighing his words, and then took a deep breath. "She found the messages," he started. "She saw we were texting each other. She got angry. I tried to explain. I tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't listen. Ava threatened to tell everyone, to destroy our family. I didn't know what to do." His voice cracked as he recounted the events. Miller could almost see him reliving those moments, which only strengthened her belief in his guilt. "I didn't want it to end like this," Nicholas continued. "We started arguing. She shoved me, and then I completely lost control. I didn't know what I was doing. When everything was over, she was on the floor, and I realized what I had done." Miller stayed calm and gave Nicholas time to process his actions. Her job now was to gather as many details as possible to confirm his confession and strengthen the case against him. "Nicholas," she said after a pause, "what did you do after this happened?" He went silent, his gaze vacant. "I just left. I couldn't look at her. I went back inside and sat down, not knowing what to do. I waited until morning and then pretended like I just found her." These words were a crucial part of the investigation. Now, Detective Miller had not only Nicholas's confession, but also a detailed account of the events that night. She knew this would be a key moment in court, and her job was to bring the case to a successful conclusion. News of Nicholas's arrest quickly spread through local media, and within days, everyone was talking about it. The story of a man who killed his wife after she discovered his affair with her mother became a topic of conversation in their small town and even across the country. Soon, the trial began. Prosecutors presented all the evidence they had collected: Nicholas's confession, the messages between him and Ava's mother, and proof that he had been at the crime scene at the time of the murder. The defense attorneys tried to argue that Nicholas had acted under severe emotional stress and couldn't fully control his actions, but the evidence was much stronger. The court sentenced Nicholas Harris to 55 years in prison without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Ava Harris had received justice, but the price of that justice was tragically steep. To watch more videos about true crimes, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. Don't forget to leave your comments and theories in the comments section. Take care of yourself, and we'll see you in the next video.